In this video, we're going to demonstrate how to play a feral druid. Let's begin by looking at stats and reforging. As you can see from the stats equation, agility is by far the most important primary stat. Based on the research that I did, as of patch 4.2, mastery, critical strike rating, and haste are all roughly equal, so there is no compelling reason to choose one over the other. Let's move on to reforging. When reforging your feral cat, there are various approaches that you can take. In one approach, you can focus on reaching the expertise and hit rating caps. In another approach, you can focus on completely ignoring your hit rating and expertise caps and instead focusing on maximizing all of your secondary stats. In yet another approach, you can focus on maximizing mastery and haste. Again, coming back to the research that I did as of patch 4.2, mastery, critical strike rating, and haste are all roughly equal. Let's take a look at some useful gems that you can use to socket your gear as a feral cat. You can see various lists of relevant and useful gems on the screen right now. As a rule of thumb, socket your gear with the pure agility gems. Those are the delicate Inferno rubies, unless the socket bonus is agility, in which case it would be worth matching the socket. Let's take a look at some useful glyphs that you can use as a feral cat. Let's start with the top 3 recommendations. They include the glyph of Rip, the glyph of Berserk, and the glyph of Shred. There are other prime glyphs that you can swap out if you want to. They're less valuable. They include the glyph of Tiger's Fury, the glyph of Shred, and the glyph of Mangle. Let's move on to the recommended major glyphs. They include the glyph of Rebirth, the glyph of Feral Charge, and the glyph of Fairy Fire. Let's talk about the glyph of Rebirth for just a moment. The way that Rebirth normally works is that it will resurrect a party member, but it will not resurrect them with full health and full mana. There are a lot of situations where I've taken advantage of Rebirth and this glyph, the glyph of Rebirth, and it's prevented wipes, because if you bring somebody back to full health and full mana, it's as though they were never killed in the first place. It's very, very useful. I strongly recommend going with this major glyph. Let's cover one more optional major glyph that you can go with. That is the glyph of Ferocious Bite. The way this glyph works is it adds a very small heal anytime you use Ferocious Bite. Now, looking at my particular glyph configuration, if I was forced to change this configuration, I would probably swap the glyph of Fairy Fire out for the glyph of Ferocious Bite. And that wraps up our glyph discussion. Let's move on to a discussion of feral talents. As with the talent discussions in the other videos, we're not going to cover every individual talent. Instead, we're just going to focus on the important ones. Feral Swiftness is a wonderful talent in my opinion, because personally I love any talent or ability that increases my movement speed. I just don't like moving slow, so I spent 2 talent points here. The benefit of Predatory Strikes is that it will increase your DPS on targets that are nearly dead. In this case, it increases your critical strike chance of Ravaged by 50%. The way Fury Swipes works is it gives your auto attacks a chance to trigger this Fury Swipe that deals 310% weapon damage, but it can only happen once every 3 seconds at a maximum. Primal Fury benefits feral cats in that whenever you're in cat form and you land a critical strike, it will always grant you an additional combo point. The really nice thing about Feral Aggression is how it buffs your Fairy Fire spell. Instead of having to repeatedly spam Fairy Fire in order to get 3 stacks, anytime you cast Fairy Fire, it will automatically apply all 3 stacks. The way King of the Jungle works is anytime you use Tiger's Fury, it'll also instantly restore 60 energy, which can be nice. Let's talk about Feral Charge and Stampede. Feral Charge is sort of like a Warrior's Charge ability, except that once you cast it, it'll actually position you right behind the target. The way Stampede works is that it actually has 2 properties. Right after you cast Feral Charge, it'll give you a buff that increases your melee haste by 15%, and more importantly, It'll cause your next Ravage to no longer require that you be in a prowling state, and you don't even need to be behind the target to use it. Always spend 1 talent point on Leader of the Pack, simply for the reason that it will grant your entire raid or party a buff that will increase their critical strike chance by 5%. Brutal Impact is a very nice talent, and the main reason why is because it'll reduce the cooldown on your Skull Bash ability. If you do a lot of interrupting like I do, then this talent is absolutely invaluable. Survival Instincts is a great 3-minute defensive cooldown. It's even useful for feral cats. Blood in the Water is the feral talent that encourages you to finish with Ferocious Bite on targets that are nearly dead. Blood in the Water has a property of whenever you cast Ferocious Bite, in this situation, it'll also refresh the duration of your Rip Dot on the target. The way Rend and Tear works is that it will actually increase the damage that your Shred does on targets that already have a bleeding effect on them, like Rip or Rake. It also increases the critical strike chance of Ferocious Bite on bleeding targets by 25%. Let's move on to the final feral talent, Berserk. The way Berserk works is it will dramatically reduce the energy cost of all of your abilities by 50%. One possible application for using Berserk is if you're entering an AoE pull where you need to repeatedly spam swipe. We'll cover that in a little bit more detail later. And that wraps up our talent discussion. Let's move on to some single target and AoE strategies for feral cats.